and then some summarizing about the main results and conclusions that I've come up with. If you at any point have some comments or questions or anything, please feel free to interrupt me because we have a lot of time here, so just raise your hand. Okay, many of you probably have read about these criminological theories, and it's probably the most prominent, has been the most prominent field within criminology in the 20th century at least. The kind of common way of thinking about these things is that low education and unemployment are something that come before crime. This is the sort of social causation perspective that I guess the most common idea is to think that low education happens for some reason, which in turn leads to labor market failures, unemployment, which in turn creates some type of strain or stress, or just plain simply lack of resources, and this causes crime. And this is a very common idea, and I have nothing against this. This is pretty much what I believe in myself as well. But there are many people who say that it's not necessarily only this way around. The first finding, of course, that speaks to this sort of reverse causation perspective is that the most chronic offenders, many of those who end up in prisons, actually start their offending pretty early on. So much earlier than any educational level or employment status are established. And I think sociologists, some of them tend to emphasize the sort of labeling perspective, that there are some mistakes that the kids do when they are young, and this leads to societal reactions. And labels are put on the people, and these labels in fact cause people to fail in education and become employed. So there might be reverse causation in play. But I would think the critique that has become more common in the last couple of decades within the sort of life course view on crime is to say that, well, actually there might be third factors at play that could explain both of these. And they, especially employment and crime, might not have so much to do with each other in a causal sense in adulthood. And there are generally people who stress this type of explanation are, you might have heard of the sort of self-control theory, who say that there are individual traits that explain both of these phenomena in adulthood. And this is the type of critique people who want to argue for the first one generally receive, in my experience at least. And I think it's safe to say that all of these three processes are probably at work to some extent. And for me, a sort of combination, a hybrid of these three is probably the most convincing way of thinking about education, employment, and crime. To think of this as that there are probably differences between people quite early on in cognitive skills, personality, impulsivity, these kinds of things. And these in turn may lead to failures in education, like the selection perspective suggests. But this doesn't mean that these failures wouldn't have any effect over that sort of stable traits that people have. So this is the idea that I think most sociologists who do this type of research now sort of subscribe to, that these sort of stable differences between individuals matters, but also failures in education and later failures in employment matter as well. And that's the way I think as well. And well, some words about education and unemployment in Finland. When we talk about dropping out from school in Finland, we don't actually, the occasion that the director mentioned where somebody couldn't read, that's quite, as he mentioned, it's very rare in Finland, of course. And there are very few people who actually don't complete their compulsory education. You might have, I know for a fact that you have, those people are overrepresented in the prison population. But when we talk about dropping out nowadays, it means those people who just complete the compulsory education. And well, there's been a great educational expansion in Finland since the so-called baby boomer generation after the World War. And the younger cohorts are very highly educated in international comparison as well. And according to if you look at the latest cohort, that's reached the age where education doesn't really change anymore. We see that 17% of men and 10% of women have only the basic educational level. All others have secondary education or higher. So this is, if you compare this to the cohorts born born after the war, this is way, way higher. So I think we don't sometimes understand that in Finland, this educational expansion is actually a quite recent thing. And I was living in the United States for 6 months just recently, and it's a very different situation there because the education level now is lower than in Finland. It used to be higher just recently. And well, we know that the basic education group is now the focus of many of public discussion and many programs, because several studies have now quite recently shown that this group of people is actually quite problematic nowadays. And these, for instance, they have very bad labor market prospects in Finland. And well, employment, I guess the educational level is rather similar across the Nordic countries nowadays. But employment rates, especially youth unemployment rates, are quite different. Finland and Sweden have quite a bit higher youth unemployment rate than Norway or Denmark have. But despite this, the studies that have examined this sort of the core of the social exclusion group that sort of needs the people in education, employment, and training, this quite recent comparative study that's very good in my opinion discovered that actually this proportion of people is very similar across the Nordic countries, so we might not be that different at all in terms of this problem we have. And the current research that I'm going to mainly talk about here is a project titled Risk Factors of Crime in Finland. It's a very generic name for a project, and one reason is that this was originally a feasibility study to investigate if we can even do this type of research, because previously we have had some problems with getting this type of data due to data security issues and things like that. So we wanted to sort of have a new go at trying to do this type of research. And well, it's safe to say that it was a success, at least in terms of getting the data. It was things that really changed since the 90s, and now it's a much better situation for people wanting to use register-based data. And I'm going to talk about this type of data in more detail just shortly. My PhD thesis is now titled Social Determinants of Crime and Violent Victimization. It's not a great title. I would like to come up with a better one, but let's see if I can do it. But the reason to me studying young adult offenders is really the fact that most prior Finnish studies have tended to focus on either adolescents, those people still in schools, or there's also a good tradition of homicide studies. But we could argue that there's a gap in between. We have this sort of, not necessarily just minor delinquency, but still acts that aren't necessarily so serious, and then we have the most serious type of offending. But we have this gap in between before. And so the sort of quite modest aim was to just describe the socioeconomic and demographic profiles of young adult offenders and see how they differ from the general population. And I'm also looking at differences in violent victimization here, and also doing this sort of methodological comparison of survey and register data. But I'm not going to talk about that here because it's probably not very interesting on you. And then, well, additional reason to focusing on young adults is that, well, they commit a lot of crime. This is the so-called age crime curve, which is replicated across countries, or probably very similar in all the Nordic countries. And this is the number of suspects in each age group in solved police-reported crimes. And we can see that the peak is around 18 years old, but there's the young adults who are defined to be 20 or between 20 or 30 years old here, do commit a lot of crime, and it's actually quite a substantial share of all crime committed, especially if you look this in more detail in certain types of crime. There's a high peak in this age group. So that is a sort of empirical reason for focusing on this group in my study. So you are probably, quite many of you are using some type of register or information system in your work for where you put the information about prisoners and education and things like that. But for us researchers, the main, why we're interested in these types of systems is that these registers actually provide exceptionally good means for analyzing some aspects of crime on population level. And the Nordic countries all have some variant of personal identification number, henkilötunnus in Finland. And this can be used to very reliably combine data from different sources. It's very, for us Nordics, this is a very, it seems like almost stupid to emphasize this, but this is actually a possibility that's only us and some other countries, only a few countries can actually do these kinds of things reliably. But despite this possibility, this kind of pure register-based research that only uses register-based data has been quite rare in criminology until only the recent years. And there's a very good Norwegian paper about this register-based data and its possibilities in the latest Crime and Justice book. So if somebody is interested in that, I can provide it to you. And of course the problem is with this kind of data is that we can only look at certain things. We cannot expect the registers to have all information about all the relevant aspects of individual lives. But you could argue that they are very good if you're interested in things like social class, income, unemployment. These are very reliably measured here in comparison to many survey data. But the main thing about this data is that we actually reach everybody. This is something that's increasingly difficult to do with surveys, especially in general population, because the response rates are declining all the time everywhere. There are so many surveys being done, because every week somebody is phoning you that would you like to answer a questionnaire about vacuum cleaners or something, and then, important things get more difficult to do at the same time. So this is at least for me, this is the main reason for trying to make this type of research more common, because I think marginalization is a big issue when we talk about crime. If we don't actually reach those people, I don't know what those data actually can tell us. So this has been my sort of main reason for using this type of data. And one other thing that is very good with this data is that we can do longitudinal research. We can follow the same individuals for long periods of time, but with short measurement intervals. If you wanted to do this with survey data, with cohort data, it would be very expensive. We would need to, and it's expensive and difficult to do because it's hard to reach the people, hard to reach the same people all over again, over and over again. And using the registers, we don't even need to trouble the people with these questions. Once again, we need to remember that it's only some aspects of individual lives we can look at, but some of these aspects are very important and central to criminology. And we can also do this retrospectively. We don't need to follow or wait for information to accumulate. We can look backwards and do sort of retrospective panel data, which is a good option, and it's quite cheap. So the data I'm going to use here is a random sample of roughly 3% of the Finnish population at the end of year 2003. And this was sampled from the Finnish population register. So this is the place that keeps is the bookkeeper of the Finnish population, if you like. And there's information from several other sources that's being combined with the data. We have something from Statistics Finland, mainly education and occupation information. Then we have information from the Social Insurance Institution of Finland that gave us the unemployment and disability pension records, and then we have income records on a yearly basis. And the data is arranged here so that I've measured all these things prior to measuring crime to try to deal with the reverse causality issue. It doesn't really solve it very well, but it does something. So at least we're measuring the risk factors before the outcome, which is crime here. And we have the crime follow-up in this study from 2005 onwards. I've mostly used a 3-year follow-up, although now we could, of course, do a much longer follow-up. We have crime information from 12 or 13 years now, so it's already a quite long follow-up we can do. And we have police-reported crime, and then we also have convictions and fines, and I'm mostly using the conviction data here to describe the results. So, I guess this is a table we could spend some time on. This is the basic picture we see in the data. And here, to start off with, I've also included income here. And there are three variables I've measured here. The first is educational level in the end of year 2004. Because these are young individuals, I've truncated the upper end. The upper secondary or higher includes all university education and all higher education. Then we have vocational education separately, and then those with only basic education. And this group now also includes those without any education, but it's a very small group of people, probably around 10 or 20 people here who don't even complete the basic education. But we can't really separate those, although it would be very good to do that, but we just can't do it with the data we have. And the income is divided into quintiles. This is from year 2004 as well. And unemployment history is measured as the number of days unemployed during the last 6 years prior to the follow-up. And I've divided that into quartiles so that you can see the length of unemployment prior to crime measurement. And this crime rate is calculated by dividing the total number of crime in each of these groups by number of person years, which basically means the number of persons here, 12,000 times 3. So, starting off with violence, we see that those who have upper secondary education or higher, during 3 years, they on average commit 1 crime per 1,000 persons on a yearly basis. Those with vocational education have a 5 times higher rate, and those with only basic education have a 25 times higher rate. So I guess if somebody wants to say that education doesn't matter, I would say it matters, definitely does. But of course, now we need to bear in mind that it's a very small proportion of these people who actually do commit crimes. Most of those with just basic education don't show up as convicts here. So this needs to be kept in mind all the time. And there needs to be a distinction between relative and absolute level of crime. And although I'm mostly talking about relative differences between these groups, the absolute level needs to be kept in mind, and we can't now go, arresting everybody who has a low education on the basis of this. It doesn't make any sense. But anyway, I think still it's important to look at the relative differences, and it's especially marked here in property crime, but also in drunk driving. It's no matter which type of crime you look at, you see a very strong association. And the same thing is replicated with income and employment. The relative differences are way smaller if you look at these types of measurements, but you still see the same pattern that the poorer the position you're in by these measurements, the more crime you commit. So it seems to be quite well in line with the social causation perspective that if you're not doing well in terms of education, employment, you're more likely to commit crime. I think this is fairly safe to say that this is the case in Finland. And do you have any questions about this, by the way? Yeah?
Is there a difference between women and men?
Yes, there actually is. The absolute level is very different between men and women. Women commit way less crime than men do, but the relative differences are similar and even bigger for females. So that females who have just basic education differ from those with upper secondary more than men do. And this is, I don't really know what's the reason to that, but one could be that females need more problems before they start committing crime. That might be one, it's a threshold. But that's only one explanation. But then the rates are very different for males and females, and that's, yeah. But the basic pattern is very similar with all these measurements here. And then the first slide looked at very crude categories of crime. And here, because then you might also think that, well, property crime, there's many different types of property crime. There's shoplifting, theft, and fraud and things like that involved. So here I'm looking at different types of violence by seriousness measured by the penal code used. And here you can actually see the pattern is quite interesting, that these are the suspects, and this actually come from a regression model, so the interpretation is that you don't really need to worry about this, but for instance, this 6.6 here means that the education effect is 6.6. The odds of minor assault are 6.6 times higher for those with basic education compared to those with upper secondary education when we control for sex, unemployment length, and some other things. So that's one reason why these look smaller here than in the prior slide, because I've controlled for several other factors in the model. But the overall picture is very similar. Here we see that actually it's not only by crime type that we see some changes. We also see that those people who commit the most serious types of violent offenses are even more disadvantaged in terms of these measurements. But the more serious violence we're talking about, the more marginalized the offender generally is. But the interesting part is that the same applies to victims as well. We see that the victims of this, especially serious cases, are in a very poor position, and many of them have their own criminal records, and you see that this serious violence probably often is part of a criminal lifestyle, and it might be a coincidence even that who is the victim at some point and who is the offender. As we know from the Finnish homicide studies, that there are these cases that homicides that happen between middle-aged male alcoholics, and then somebody just ends up dead after many days of drinking. And it might be that this is a symptom of the same thing we see in the younger population here. But the thing is that we actually see very big differences by these measures, both in victimization and violent offending, especially in the serious end. And well, this probably comes a little bit closer to your interest, because now we can also see the population that actually ends up in prison. And here I've only looked at sentences, numbers of convictions and types of convictions during 2 years here. And then I've looked at the background before that in terms of education and unemployment length. And here, first, if you look at education, the sort of same pattern is seen as the prior slides already hinted, that if you look at those who were sentenced to a conditional sentence, 57% of those had only basic education. If you look at those sentenced to community service, it's 74, and those with an unconditional, meaning incarceration, the share of those with basic education is 81. So the closer we are coming to the prison population, the more disadvantaged the population becomes, even in comparison to the other offenders. And the same applies to number of convictions. The more convictions one has, the less the educational level generally is. And type of convictions show the same thing as previous, but property crime seems to have the greatest amount of non-educated offenders. And in the general population, the share of those with basic education is 18 in this sample, so the difference is pretty huge. But unemployment doesn't actually work quite in the same way. This is at least two things. The fact that some of these people serving unconditional sentences have probably not been unemployed because of the prison sentence before. But it could also be that the register-based data the problem is they're looking at official unemployment here. So there are many indications in the data that show that actually some of the most chronic offenders never even sign up as unemployed. So that's a pretty big problem and you probably know all this, but there seems to be at least a considerable proportion of those, for instance, who commit low property crimes, who never, for some reason, even receive the societal support for their unemployment. And there might be many reasons to this, but we see this in the data that the unemployment history doesn't work in the same way as education does. But here the group with the highest number of convictions, or the prison population, they actually have less days unemployed than some of the other offending groups. So this is something that I didn't expect, but it might have to do with data quality, but I cannot actually be quite sure yet. And this shows the basic same pattern, that if you look at, this is the number of convictions, there's somebody who has 187 convictions during 3 years, so that's quite a lot. I don't even know how that's possible, but it's property crime, I guess. But yeah, you can see, for instance, if you look at income, it declines steadily. The more offenses one has, the lower the income during 3 years generally is. The greater is the proportion with no occupation. This is based on another measure, and the proportion without secondary education also rises pretty much linear. There are some people here who, but these are so few people here that I wouldn't really pay too much attention to this. But unemployment doesn't seem to work out in the same way. There's quite a lot of fluctuations here. There are many people who, even though they have a lot of crime, we know that they don't have much income, but they still don't show up as unemployed. So there's a problem of the system meeting the needs of these individuals, definitely. But to look into this in more detail, we will need a better data. This is not good enough yet. We don't have all the measures of social assistance in this data, which it's very difficult to get that in the future as well. I think it should be investigated at some point in more detail, what's actually going on with these individuals. And then something more about the unemployment and crime. I became interested in this because, because of those results, and there's a big literature in employment and crime. It's not only criminology, there's also labor economists who've done a lot of work on this. And there's this sort of selection argument. This is very prevalent there. And I also anticipated that if I just presented results like this, people will say to me that, well, isn't our education just a marker for something else? It's just intelligence or something else. So I wanted to do something more robust, if you like, with the data we have, because we actually have these longitudinal measurements of unemployment. Education can really be used here because employment or education only moves upwards. Because if somebody completes an education, it's very rare that it gets taken away from him. But employment is something that varies in a way that makes it more suitable target for studying in a temporal fashion. And actually, although previously we saw that the offenders in all types of crime tended to have these longer unemployment histories, it's actually, if you look at the same individuals during 6 years and look at the unemployment at the time of the offense, we don't really see the same picture anymore. We only see that unemployment is, if you look at the same individual, we only see that property crime is more common during the life course of the same individual when he's unemployed. But we don't see the same for violent crime anymore, not for drunk driving either. So this it's a very tentative finding. It might be about the data quality, that it just doesn't measure, because it doesn't measure unemployment in a completely reliable fashion. So it might be that this is the reason for us not detecting any unemployment-violent crime connection. But there are also many theories that say that, well, you shouldn't basically see that, because if the effect is attributable to economic problems, property crime has been the solution to that problem. But I'm really a little bit torn in between these sort of two opposites here. That even though I don't see the effect on violent crime, I still see that these offenders do have way longer unemployment histories. But the temporal change isn't very straightforward regarding violent crime. And the same thing, another thing that's also, I think, very interesting is this so-called active labor market policies that all the Nordic countries have. And there are actually some recent Danish studies by the Rockwool Foundation that have investigated this association between these ALMPs and the youth offending. And these are actually very good studies, in my opinion, at least in statistical terms. And they have found that this program seems to reduce youth crime. There are problems from Danes here, so if you know about these studies and the problems with these, please let me know, but I haven't been able to find those problems. And in Finland, on the other hand, these ALMPs are especially targeted at young adults aged 18 to 24. And the effort is to both enhance their labor market prospects in the future, but there's clearly this threat effect as well, that to make unemployment less of an easy option. This is something that I know is being done in Denmark, at least. It's the so-called security model. And this is the same thing in Finland, that there is a certain pressure to make receiving unemployment benefits not so easy, to find more incentives to work. And I'm not really, I don't know if these things work in general. The evidence I've read of is that the LMP evidence on employment is actually very mixed. And yeah, but the interesting part is that, oh yeah, and in Finland, the statement from Kela, it's also an insurance institution website, saying that unemployed individual must actively seek employment and accept offered work or training to stay eligible for benefits. So this might actually be one of the reasons why the high-risk population doesn't really stay eligible and doesn't show up as unemployed in the previous analysis. But anyway, the most common types of ALMD in Finland are employment training and subsidized work in public and private sector workplaces. And we actually see the same result as the Danes did. And we see that if you look at only those individuals who receive both the passive and active forms of so-called labor market subsidy in Finland, we see that during the ALMP periods, crime is lower for some reason. We don't really know why it is, but it's probably not because of money, because they do receive the same money during these both periods. So it might be about, social bonds or just routine activities. These are the main explanations applied in the literature. I can't really tell which one of these is operational here, but I think social bond explanation, or the so-called stakes in conformity approach, seems liable. That when you have a group of a context where you spend your time and have colleagues, even if the work isn't something that you're going to make a career out of, it might still have desirable effects for crime. Or at least it seems like that in this data. But this is also very tentative and very, very. This could be done in a much better way in the future, and I hope that I can do it. But it all depends on the data what we can get. So to summarize the main results of my study is, well, the main finding is that young adults with low levels of education and long employment histories are strongly overrepresented among perpetrators of crime. And this is not a surprise as such, but I think the magnitude is a little bit of a surprise. You probably heard the talk by my boss, Tapio Lappi-Seppälä, yesterday about the welfare state and its virtues. So it's still somewhat difficult to understand why the Nordic countries show such great differences by these socioeconomic measures in general. And I think one of the reasons is that we have just plain and simply better data, because we reach everybody, or a sample of everybody, and we actually reach those people who are the homeless, the drug abusers, people like that, who are generally not reached in any of the studies. That might be one reason that some of the prior studies have just underestimated these effects simply because of non-response. And yes, we need to bear in mind that it's a relative rather than absolute effect. Most individuals with low education who are persistently unemployed do not commit crimes. But when we compare these individuals with the normal populations, those serving time in prison are especially radically different in terms of educational level. And this is something you of course know. And temporal linkage between unemployment and crime is only robust for property crime in this analysis. So we cannot prove that unemployment would also be a causal factor behind violent crime. But this needs to, there are very different results in international studies, and this is a field that's probably we're gonna see better studies on these subjects in the coming years, and I hope that this can be done in Finland as well. And well, limitations. You all know that correlation isn't causation. It's very difficult to identify causal effects with observational data, like the one we have, when we don't have any experiments that we could use. And this is something that I think researchers are becoming more and more aware of, and it's becoming more and more difficult to claim that this actually matters if you haven't somehow tried to deal with the selection problem. And I think the major shortcoming with the register-based datasets is that the individual traits that are known to be important in explaining crime, like cognitive skills, impulsivity, personality, things like that, we can't really measure those without incorporating some kind of survey to our data. And then the need problem is another separate issue that we don't probably, although we include everybody, we can't necessarily identify them. And this probably leads to an underestimation of unemployment effect, as I mentioned. And well, several high rate offenders are never registered as unemployed during the six-year period. So for me, this is quite alarming finding. And well, in general, I think we need a better identification of those truly marginalized, with, well, for instance, substance abuse and mental health problems, to get a better picture of the whole social exclusion problem. And well, like I mentioned, it's somewhat interesting to see that these SES measures show such strong associations in Nordic data. As I mentioned, I was just living in the United States and living in Philadelphia, which is a very segregated city. And living there, it's quite hard to come to the conclusion that Nordic countries would be especially equal. That would be the reason why we see these effects. That cannot be the case. There must be some other explanation. It's clear that most countries in the world are more unequal than us in terms of income distribution, educational opportunities. So this is something that needs to be studied more. And I'd just like to advertise a forthcoming Nordic comparison we're now doing with colleagues from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. Iceland was unfortunately excluded because the access to register-based data is not so good there, in my understanding. But we're trying to look at this sort of reverse causation thing here as a first exercise, to look at the effects of first imprisonment on employment. And I hope that we'll have something out by let's say, before next summer. And there you can see that partners involved in this, the Statistics Norway, Rockwool Foundation from Denmark, and Stockholm University, and then us from Finland. So if you're later interested in this, you might consult these local partners and ask if there's anything new on this front. It might be interesting to you to see as well. And if you find that this kind of research is something we can actually do, if we actually find the comparable measures in the registers, I think this is a very important and promising avenue for comparative research that should be investigated further. So, some conclusions about education. I think, well, even though causation and correlation are different things, I still think that preventing dropping out from secondary education, I think especially the vocational track, is important. And this is because we see that the education effect is very robust with Finnish data. We have tried controlling for quite many other explanations. We have controlled for family background, ADHD, learning difficulties, for unemployment and low income, and then prior crime. And no matter which of these we control, we always see a very strong education effect that persists even though we control these kinds of factors. And I have to mention that all of these are very important as such, but they cannot account for the education effect. So if somebody comes and tells to you that it's only about ADHD, it's not. It's something else as well. But the causal effect, I think, is very likely because I think the best evidence comes from economics in this regard, from studies who have been able to use natural experiments. They have looked at these school leaving age reforms in USA, UK, and Sweden. They actually just found out about these Swedish studies a couple of days ago. And all of this saw that the mandatory school leaving age, when it was increased, crime was subsequently reduced. But I still think that this is very important evidence on the virtues of education, but I would still be a little bit careful when there have been these suggestions in Finland we should increase the minimum age school leaving to 18 years old. I don't think this evidence actually tells us in strict terms if we should do that. I think it would probably reduce crime, but it's in these times when the money is short, I don't know if this is something that's actually feasible. But I think this is something that you probably can also debate, and I don't really have the answers. But I just want to ask the question that is the utility there for educating 1% more, and what would the implications be for crime or the prison population? I think there are, or should these efforts be more targeted, should be do more individual-based efforts to keep some individuals in school. I don't really know. This is something that you must have a better grasp on than I do. And regarding unemployment, I think something that I haven't really talked about here is that I think one of the underlying issues here that the changes in demand for labor, that decreasing demand for this sort of low-skilled manual labor is probably quite detrimental for this highest group we are dealing with here. And this has been suggested in Finnish homicide research that the population mostly responsible for homicide is males who previously were employed in these kinds of transitional jobs that are just no longer available to the same extent. So this might be the so-called structural unemployment we're talking about here. And this is something that I think should be considered further, that is it really reasonable to assume that everybody will become an engineer or something else, researcher or whatever? Or should the Nordic societies as well have jobs for everybody? I think this is an important question. It's something that I can't really answer in empirical means, but I think there are many indicators indicators that show that this demand has actually decreased, and I don't know if its implications on the prison population have been thoroughly investigated yet. And well, getting employed after imprisonment seems to reduce crime in observational settings in Nordic countries. There are some quite new good studies that have looked at employment compared to those who are employed with those who didn't after being imprisoned, and they find that recidivism is much lower among those with employment. Of course, the selection problem is there. They have used several control variables to take into account the selection in the employment. The problematic part is, I don't know, you might know some other studies, but the ones that I've read cannot really yet show a very strong employment program effect. These are mostly American studies that haven't really, even though we believe that employment should reduce offending, we perhaps haven't found the ways to at least design programs that would be somehow patented solution to this. But this is once again, I think the educational part is something that's very established, but the employment part is something that we need to work on more. And I think these active labor market policies do seem very promising in reducing youth crime in Denmark and Finland. And I think I guess it's common sense to think that it's better that young people who are disabled or anything, but they should be doing something else than just be at home. But how to do it, I don't know if the ALMP is the right solution, because it might be that the strong restrictions we're now imposing on young people might actually have also this counterproductive effects, and they might push people into these agencies because unemployment is so it's so difficult to be unemployed. But I don't really know which part of this is I think this is a scale. We need to consider if the ALMP does more good than harm. And so far, the evidence I have seems to imply that ALMPs are good in terms of crime. But this other side of the coin needs to be investigated before making any definite claims about the virtues of ALMPs for crime in Finland and Nordic countries in general. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mikko. It was very interesting. Now, if you have some